Welcome to QueerTWENTY, the cohort of 2023. QueerTWENTY is egomonk's annual flagship program that celebrates exceptional queer Indians across the industries of business, social impact, culture, and many more. Today, we have with us an economist, policy professional, startup leader, and now an author of the book Caged Tiger: How Too Much Government is Holding Indians Back, Subhashish Bhadra. We'll start off with talking about the experience of coming out and, what does that mean and whether coming out is even a necessary thing for everybody. Like, does that even apply to everybody within the queer community? And do you also think that maybe coming out or not coming out, whatever that means, that nuance, is also a way of empowering oneself or not feeling the need to maybe talk to people about yourself beyond a certain necessity? What is your take look like on that?
Got it. I do think that everyone's experience with coming out or everyone's propensity to come out is extremely contextual based on their circumstances. To that extent, I think even choosing not to come out or choosing to come out in a not very visible way or choosing to come out in certain aspects of your life but in not other aspects of life, I think all of these are part of what I might even call kind of the autonomy of that individual. And to the extent that the individual exercises that and says, look, I'm not going to come out to a certain set of people or in the workplace or whatever else, I think that is certainly their prerogative. I think the question obviously one has to ask as a society is, why in so many circumstances is coming out even a process, right? And coming out should not even be a thing. You don't obviously expect straight people to necessarily come out. So to that extent, I think the aspiration as a society should be to one day come to a position where it's absolutely irrelevant. But yeah, I think to the extent that we're not in that perfect society yet, whatever choice people choose is really up to them.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I do hear, I think in my hearing of what you said, I do see it as a more of an empowered decision on retaining that agency within each individual's hands on choosing what that even looks like. So I think a follow-up then comes to me is, what does being out and proud then mean to you? Like, speaking of you and your personal context and how you navigate different identities, across your profession, from an author, from a content leader, to your personal identities. What does that look like for you? What is out and proud for you?
So for me, out and proud is about just having complete comfort with your identity and being able to be yourself in different identities in a way that's not even really a question or not a second thought. What I mean by that, for example, is if you're in a corporate space, in the corporate space, you will obviously be you will be surrounded by people who don't look like you if you happen to be from the community, and then among those people, do you still kind of continue to feel comfortable? Do you continue to not feel other? And I think it's a two-way process. It's not necessarily just, let's say, a company or workplace's obligation to make you feel comfortable. Obviously, it is. But it's also your obligation to help them come along in that journey if they are being or if they're demonstrating the ability to be good allies, then to actually bring them along in that journey. So for me, being kind of in these environments, in these situations, and not really having to have any kind of second thoughts is really what being out and proud means.
I love that. And I think what I also love about your approach to it is the element of othering and not basically addressing the concept of othering within different spaces and not to live with that. But I think a thought that definitely comes up is just adding to a bit of what you shared on one, of course, it is not your workplace's obligation to, make it that way, but how does an individual bring along the organization? Because how does that navigation happen for you?
So one of the things I've realized is that in most cases, people's hesitation to a certain set of ideas or non-openness is often born out of ignorance. And to the extent that you can educate them through your own life experiences by sharing that with them, or even perspectives that might not be your life experience but something that you know of, I think that helps bring people along. And in the organizations that I've been part of, I think I've been able to play that role, which is to talk to them about experiences that might not be very familiar to them. And I think that's one of the ways in which you can, for example, bring your organization along. The other ways is obviously that um, othering comes in many shapes and forms, right? And a sexuality based othering is one aspect of it, but there's so many other ways, right? In
Mhm.
terms of caste, in terms of gender, in terms of socioeconomic status, and there's so many other forms of othering that happen. So for you to actually make this an issue that's bigger than just LGBTQ rights, and talk about this as a bigger diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda becomes really important, because that's when you start changing the hearts and minds of your organization from saying that, hey, look, maybe you have to address like a gender disbalance, or we have to address a caste disbalance, to saying, look, we need to overcome um, discrimination, systematic or otherwise, of all kinds. And I think that becomes really important. And I've been lucky to be in organizations where people have been really willing to reflect on their subconscious biases, and I think that is something that any employee and any person in the community can really help their employers do.
Absolutely. I think what I hear in your approach is also the fact that as a society, probably the need across identities, especially if we are talking about workspaces and navigating the public sphere, or even the private sphere for that matter, is remembering that there's always scope for growth and there's always scope for learning and navigating, I guess, how do you figure out where what that is and kind of putting yourself in those places.
And that has to come from a great degree of empathy, right? Even as people who might be from the community, there, I mean, the community itself is a fairly wide spectrum. And
Mhm.
you yourself might not have had exposure to every element of the community. So, one is really challenging yourself and saying that, look, A, within the community, but B, about circumstances that I might not know, right? I mean, I'm a super privileged male in India, which is useful, right? But then I have to be able to push my boundaries in understanding circumstances, someone who's not come from a position of privilege as I have. So I think A, that becomes really important. And B, as you think about really bringing about change, I think it becomes important to bring about change in the underlying values of society,
Mhm.
rather than just extremely issue-based thing. Because when you bring about change that's issue-based, I think there's a greater chance of it really receding and not sticking on. And when you say, hey, look, we in general have to be a far more diverse organization, if you keep pushing the boundaries, I think that's a conversation that you can repeatedly have at a workplace.
Absolutely. So I think, like for our audiences, I think how I would summarize it really is, and in what I heard from you is also for each person to really arrive at a place of self-awareness and in the sense of what is your specific context, like you brought in your privilege in, like as a male person in India. So arriving at your context and arriving at the contexts of the people that you're dealing with, and then understanding what does that navigation look like. I feel like that's where the context becomes more nuanced. That I think brings me to this the other element that comes in when we talk about pride today, and we talk about pride in the corporate setting is rainbow washing. So I think June becomes exceedingly a month where you see rainbow logos everywhere. You see a lot of campaigns around it. And while that is great, but then there's also been this whole element of queer folks from the community talking about how this is again commodification or tokenization of the community. So, as somebody who's been extensively in the corporate space and navigated these situations, how do you think corporate spaces can, continue to work towards this space of inclusion without tokenization? How does that look like for you?
Got it. So look at the first level, I don't necessarily think of tokenization as a entirely bad thing. What I mean by that is that whenever you're trying to bring about change, one of the first few things that happens is a certain amount of change in vocabulary. And that
Mhm.
change in vocabulary might not be accompanied by a change in substance. So, to the extent that we are even talking about it, to the extent that this is even being put up as, hey, this is, Pride Month, or this is Pride Day, or whatever else, any kind of just something that organizations do, for sure, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's the start of a
Yeah.
conversation. It's about becoming visible.
Yeah.
Obviously, the risk is getting stuck there. and
Mhm.
not being able to move on from there. And
Yeah.
that's what I think employees, especially those in leadership positions or those who've come from positions of privilege where they can really push back and have that conversation with their employer, which obviously not many people in our country can. But in case you find yourself in that position of privilege, it's important to approach it with a sense of empathy, right? Because you're bringing about people who are in their 40s, 50s on a journey of change. You can't expect them to be perfect on the day
Mhm.
that you join, and you have to have that little bit of leeway with them. The second is that you are the one who are going, you at some level have to kind of come out with ideas and guide them along the way, right? Because they don't necessarily understand your experience. So to the extent that you don't talk about it, to the extent that you don't ask about it, then what can they do, right?
Mhm.
So in my journey, for example, two things were two instances that I remember. One is in terms of some policies we had where your spouse could get certain benefits from the company. And I say, hey, what happens if my spouse is of the same gender? And they're like, oh, we hadn't thought about it. So now one way to
Mhm.
look at it is to say, hey, how horrible of you to have never thought about it. But the other way to look about it is, okay, now you know about it, so let's talk together about what we can do with respect to that. The second is, even as my previous organization started this conversation on DEI, I think we had a lot of intense discussions because these discussions are not simple. What do you think about a privileged gay man versus someone who is straight but comes from an underprivileged background? How do you even think about comparing lack of privilege? And obviously, you don't need to compare, but how do you kind of reconcile a DEI agenda for an organizations that tend to be small? In a 1,000-member organization, easy. In a six-member
Mhm.
organization, how do you think about DEI? So we had a lot of these very tough conversations that I think, therefore, all of these things around having a particular day, month, whatever, really become important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I think the bit that I really love about your entire approach to this also is just having the courage to have those conversations, and when you have the ability and the privilege and the power, then using that to keeping on having that open door and those conversations. And I agree, AI conversations are never easy, because it's identity can hold so many nuances. It's never easy to have one truth at all times. It's always shifting. Um, okay, so that I think then brings me to a question on, so when you're navigating these conversations, but the tokenization, I hear that you start somewhere, and so it may start there, and the problem becomes when it gets stuck there. But the other side of it also is when, for example, a queer person out and in the organization, there's a risk that they tend to become the go-to person for all the agendas, right? Like wherein you just like lean heavily on the labor and the subjective opinion and context of one person for everything within the organization, and that can often happen in a small to medium scale organization for sure. But I'm sure like across larger scale, that reality may be just like a few more numbers. How do you push back, and how do you use your privilege and power without becoming that go-to person? How do you navigate that in your experience?
So I think two things. One is, unless DEI becomes a shared agenda, and unless everyone believes that they have something to add, it really doesn't go anywhere. I don't think DEI can be the exclusive responsibility of one particular individual. So, for
Mhm.
example, in which case my previous organization tried to really drive a DEI agenda was to bring together a DEI council. Now that DEI council have people from different genders, from different economic or regional backgrounds, and then that becomes a shared responsibility, and you're having these conversations at every point, right? The
Yeah.
point is not necessarily always to make decisions and go to that one token person and make the decisions, but to have conversations, which are really more important. So
Yeah.
having DEI become a shared responsibility rather than one person's guidance becomes really important in that case. But the second thing that I think people in positions of power everywhere, whether queer or not, ought to do is to really be aware of their limitations and the limitations of their experiences.
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of people who come from a fair amount of privilege be so fixated with socioeconomic uh, inequality in the country that I think they forget the other aspects of discrimination, other axes of othering. And I think it becomes really important for therefore for people in positions of power to really let go of their own preformed notions and say, okay, you know what, I understand you're an extremely privileged person, but maybe you face discrimination in something else that I don't fully understand.
Mhm.
And that's the other aspect of it, which is no matter how deep your trauma is or how intense your experience of othering is, one has to realize it's just not representative of the country.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. And I think that also enables space holding in a way which is not intensively laborious in tokenizing. I guess like I think that's a great way to approach it. Okay, coming to leadership roles, I think we've spoken a lot of it in terms of what does that look like and how does that create impact while people are also trying to advance their careers at the end of the day. I think a question then that comes to me is in our conversation so far, I've understood from you how leadership within a corporate setting becomes also a place or a position of advocacy for other folks who may not have the power and the privilege to speak or push open a door and talk to people. So I think what advice I would ask you, like tomorrow, what advice do you have for other younger queer folks? Or even like younger is again subjective, it's not necessarily defined by age and number. Um, what advice would you have to them who are aspiring for leadership positions? And it's a space of its own. Corporate leadership, it's a very unique space of its own, especially in the Indian context today. So, what advice would you have for them? How do they navigate their multiple identities and roles while wanting to thrive in the workplace?
So I think the first and most important thing to do is to very quickly figure out if an organization is going to be supportive of your needs. Those needs could be your needs to be comfortable in your identity or your needs otherwise. If you find that an organization is not really aligned at a very kind of moral level with what you want to do, then it's probably not the right place. You'll never be able to build a very strong and good career there. So I think that becomes the basic thing that you have to do. But once you've identified such an organization, every organization at the end of the day has its own politics. Leadership position is a lot about bringing your best EQ and understanding the pulse and the politics of a workplace, and then seeing how do you become most effective at your job in that context. That understanding of people and understanding organizational dynamics might mean you might say, hey, look, I'm going to I think it's really important for me in the short term to make diversity, equity, and inclusion a very important part of the agenda. Or you might say, look, just by virtue of being in these rooms and being who I am, I can bring about change. So the path to change might look very, very different in each one of these. In my case, for example, because I was part of this organization which already cared a fair amount about DEI, I don't think it was as much of a challenge for me or to be comfortable in my own identity. But then I started looking at the wider sector. And if you look at the sectors that I come from, which is around investing in venture capital and startups, that's where you see a severe underrepresentation of people who self-identify and publicly identify as being part of the community. So that's okay. Like, look, here's maybe not in my organization, but in the wider context of this group, there's a challenge, and that's when I started really talking a lot more about um, both the kind of mental health aspects of it, but also the everyday, the everyday joys and traumas having coming from my experience. And I started talking about it on LinkedIn, where I have a fairly large audience in this particular community of investors and startups and all of that. So therefore, all of that to say that as someone aspires to a leadership position, identify an organization that just gives you the opportunity to do that. But secondly, in terms of your identity, you choose where you want to be. I've seen a lot of successful people in corporate positions actually determine fairly early on in their career that they're going to be extremely visible um, advocates of gay rights, whereas some people choose to be slightly more strategic about it. And I think both of them are extremely legitimate choices.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for sharing even, I think, your approach and your industry specific thought on how do you like even strategize which form works. I think that's very important to know because I think a lot of the times when we read a lot, we can tend to imagine that advocacy or leadership looks only in one way, and that's the only one metric, but it can be very, very variable, as you shared.
And I think the other thing I will add is what becomes really important is diversity in terms of hiring. Um, the industry I belong to has this annoying habit of hiring lots of people from IITs, usually male. And at the time when I was running some of these hiring processes, I at least set some of started tracking the numbers. How many women candidates am I interviewing? How many people from tier two, tier three cities am I interviewing? Obviously, sexuality becomes slightly more difficult in those kind of contexts to
Yeah.
necessarily decipher. But doing that, and secondly, just having these rules. For example, I always made sure that if I'm doing the first round of interviews, I send at least a substantial number of candidates from quote unquote diverse backgrounds to the next round. And I think that becomes really critical. So in the few years towards the end of my last stint, when I was leading some of these processes, we actually ended up hiring a lot of people from religious minorities, from tier two, tier three cities, from non-engineering backgrounds, as funny as it might sound.
No, it's, I mean, I get it. I totally get it. And I think in my mind, I was also thinking about the part of what you said in terms of tokenization. I mean, this is literally bracketing people, but how important it also is to make the space truly inclusive as well, because how else do you do it?
And I think having since then worked with those colleagues, that I think it was anything but tokenization, because I think those people genuinely, you hire for diversity because you want diverse perspectives, and I think those people really came in and shared those diverse perspectives. So I don't think it was even tokenization; it was genuinely good for business.
Yeah. I love the phrasing at the end of it, because it also, I think this was literally my last question as well, that in spaces that you've especially been in, like tech and finance and startup, like how do you make that more inclusive? And I think hiring with that perspective, and the fact that it is actually good for business, I think it's also a good way to remember. And any other ways that come to your mind, I'll just like open that to you for a minute.
Yeah, look, I think there's genuinely a very strong economic case for or business case for diversity of different kinds, and um, I I got the opportunity to really contribute to that in my previous organization, and I think I really tested, not always in a very pleasant way, but I really tested my previous organization a lot by pushing its boundaries in terms of how we thought about these issues, and even my current organization for that matter. Um, I think what's really important is for people to realize that. Sometimes the kind of market opportunity resides in reaching out to communities that are, from business perspective, under-tapped or underserved. For example, when you think about obviously gender being one of the most visible axes of that kind of under-penetration or kind of structural discrimination, you think of, hey, but the amount of either consumption that is controlled by women, either in the family or by themselves, the amount of time that might be spent online, etc. You really open up an entirely new demographic for you as a business to serve. And if you want to serve that business very well, you need to really have, for example, your product managers. You need to have a substantial part of number of them be women, because if they are not there, then you have people who don't necessarily understand the context as well. Or you need someone, for example, from tier two, tier three cities, if that's the target audience that you're going behind. So I think if you, as a business, really keep hiring from these privileged communities, then as in a country of India's size, you're not really serving India. You're probably serving like four cities,
Yeah.
and that is at least the argument that I've always made. A lot of my colleagues have always made that to build for a country of India's diversity, you need to have a workforce that is as diverse.
Yeah.
You cannot design for India if you are from South Delhi or South Bombay.
On that note, I think I would close this section of the conversation, giving just like this last message that I heard from our conversation so far, that everybody, it makes business sense to be diverse and inclusive. So please, just like try. And I think the last bit of this conversation is our rapid fire questions. So these are just going to be very, very brief, one word or one line, whatever it is that comes to your mind. So are you ready, Subhashish?
I hope so.
Not to scare you, but okay. The first question is describe your coming out experience in one word.
Very deliberate, very deliberate and very strategic. Hi, Xenia, can you still hear me?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes. Unfortunately, my power went out. Okay, we'll start again. So the first question is describe your coming out experience in one word.
My coming out experience was extremely deliberate and extremely strategic.
Strategic. All right. I think I'll take strategic for sure. Okay. What LGBTQI plus stereotype annoys you the most?
Of them being extremely fashionable, I think that puts a lot of pressure.
I love that. Okay. What is the one thing that you would like to see change for the community?
I would like a lot more. I think too much of the community centered around the online space, and I would love for more offline spaces to emerge in India, which I experience in the UK, but not as much here.
Oh, love that. Love that. I mean, I would love to also say that for sure. Okay. One piece of advice for young queer professionals aiming for corporate leadership.
It would be to be impatient in a very strategic and patient way. What I mean by that is never let the fire die down. Don't become part of the system, but also don't be in a hurry to tear the system apart.
Oh, I love that. That's actually very nice. Thank you. I really like that. Okay. The first thing that pops into your head when you hear the following words: diversity and inclusion.
Business imperative.
Okay. Allyship.
Tricky but critical.
Mm-hmm. Homophobia.
Very 1980s.
Okay. India.
A massive opportunity in so many ways. A unique opportunity for human history.
Oh wow, love that. Okay. And the last one, queer stories.
Just not enough. Need more of them in the public space.
Ah, love that. Love that. Absolutely agree with you on that. With that, we have come to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Subhashish. I feel like this was a very enlightening conversation for me. I learned a lot from you, and I feel like I see the wisdom that that exists behind the digital presence that I've seen. So I think I got to really know you a little better today. And thank you for giving us time and thank you for sharing your journey with us.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure speaking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Celia, would you stop recording so that we know and then we can, I would like